In the final year of the war, as Germany faced mounting pressure across its territory and its airfields were repeatedly disrupted, something unexpected appeared in the sky. It did not resemble the aircraft that had defined the conflict until then. Its engines produced a sharp, unfamiliar sound, and its speed felt unnatural, sleek, unfamiliar, and faster than anything opposing forces had previously encountered. For the first time since the war began, German pilots entered the air in a machine that could outrun its pursuers. To those who witnessed its early flights, the promise seemed unmistakable. Here was an aircraft capable of reaching opposing formations, striking swiftly, and disengaging before responses could fully form. Traditional piston-driven fighters, limited by established designs, suddenly appeared outdated. In theory, this single aircraft offered Germany a path back into the skies, a chance to regain influence through innovation rather than scale. But history is rarely generous to breakthroughs that arrive too late. The irony of the Me-262 lay not in its design, but in its timing. Conceived years earlier, delayed by political decisions, production challenges, and uncertainty at the highest levels, the jet entered service when Germany no longer held firm control of its own airspace. Fuel was limited. Experienced pilots were fewer. Industrial capacity was under constant strain. The future had arrived, but it had landed in unfavorable conditions. The effort to field the aircraft reflected the state of the nation itself. Engineers worked under continuous pressure. Mechanics relied on improvised solutions and inconsistent materials. Pilots operated from shortened runways, aware that a single interruption could render an aircraft unusable before it ever left the ground. Even the jet's engines, remarkable feats of engineering, required frequent replacement after only brief periods of use. Speed came with a cost Germany could no longer sustain. And yet, when the Me-262 did take to the air, its effect was undeniable. Opposing formations were caught off guard. Escort aircraft struggled to respond effectively. Observers took notice, not with alarm, but with careful assessment. This was not a weapon capable of changing the war's outcome, but it was a clear indication of what future conflicts would resemble. The realization was quiet, almost reflective. The Me-262 did not fail because it was flawed. It failed because innovation alone cannot reverse a broader collapse. It reshaped the future of air combat, but it could not reshape the present. And as pressure closed in for years, German engineers and Luftwaffe planners had chased an idea that felt almost theoretical. If speed had defined air power in the 1,930 seconds, then the next war, they believed, would be decided by something faster still. Drawings circulated quietly through design bureaus' aircraft without propellers, powered by thrust alone. To many senior officers, the concept felt distant, impractical. But to those closest to the science, it was destiny delayed. When the Me-262 finally lifted from the runway, it did not simply fly, it announced a new age. Its silhouette was clean, almost alien, its acceleration startling. Pilots accustomed to piston engines felt themselves pushed back into their seats as the aircraft surged forward. In level flight, it left propeller-driven fighters behind as if they were standing still. For the first time in the war, the boundaries of aerial combat shifted in a single moment. Yet the shock of its arrival was tempered by a harsh irony. By the time the jet was ready, Germany was no longer fighting for advantage, but for survival. Allied bombers roamed the skies with increasing freedom. Fuel was rationed. Airfields were damaged as quickly as they were repaired. The aircraft that promised dominance entered service when the conditions required for dominance had already vanished. The struggle to field the Me-262 became a reflection of the war itself. Production schedules slipped under bombing raids. Engine reliability suffered from material shortages. Strategic confusion slowed deployment as debates raged over whether the jet should be used as a fighter or a bomber. Every delay stole time Germany no longer possessed. What should have been a decisive leap forward became a race against collapse. And still, the jet's significance could not be denied. Allied pilots reported encounters that defied expectation. Commanders took note, adjusting tactics not for the present war, but for the next one. The Me-262 was not changing outcomes, it was changing assumptions. The future of aviation had arrived early, even if victory had not. The revelation came without triumph. The jet would not save Germany. It arrived burdened by shortages, indecision, and time itself. But as the war moved toward its conclusion, one truth became clear. Even in defeat, the Me-262 had redrawn the horizon. And beyond that horizon, a new era of warfare was already. When the Me-262 entered combat, its effect was immediate and unsettling. Allied bomber crews, long accustomed to fighting off waves of propeller-driven interceptors, suddenly faced an aircraft that appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. Closing at speeds exceeding 800 kilometers per hour, the jets sliced through bomber formations with heavy cannon fire, often destroying a target in a single pass. For those on the receiving end, the encounter felt less like a dogfight and more like an execution carried out at impossible speed. Among German commanders, belief hardened into hope. Here, at last, was a machine capable of challenging Allied air superiority, the dominance that had drained Germany's industry, morale, and manpower. The Me-262 did not need to outnumber the enemy. It only needed to be present. A small number of jets, properly deployed, seemed capable of inflicting disproportionate damage, forcing Allied planners to rethink tactics that had gone unchallenged for months. But the irony of the aircraft's power lay in its fragility. The same engines that granted the Me-262 its speed were prone to failure, often lasting only a few dozen flight hours before needing replacement. Takeoffs and landings, not combat, were the most dangerous moments. The jet was vulnerable on the ground, exposed to strafing attacks as it accelerated slowly down damaged runways. Speed made it dominant in the air, yet helpless when stationary. For the pilots, the struggle was both technical and psychological. Many were experienced fighter aces, trained on machines that forgave mistakes. The jet did not. Throttle mismanagement could destroy engines. High landing speeds left little margin for error. Training time was short, fuel was scarce, and losses mounted not only to the enemy, but to accidents. Mastery demanded time Germany no longer possessed. The revelation came quietly, without celebration. The Me-262 was everything its designers had promised, and still not enough. Its potential was undeniable, but potential does not win wars. Operational effectiveness depends on logistics, training, and endurance. As the conflict closed in on Germany from all sides, the jet remained a glimpse of a future that could not yet be fully realized. And with each passing week, the question grew heavier. By late 1944, belief hardened into desperation. Within the German High Command, the Me-262 came to be seen not merely as an advanced aircraft, but as the last credible chance to alter the balance of the air war. Conventional fighters had failed to stop the bombers. Anti-aircraft guns could only blunt the damage. What remained was speed overwhelming, untouchable speed, and the hope that technology might succeed where strategy no longer could. In combat, the jet appeared to justify that faith. Allied formations, once methodical and confident, found themselves suddenly vulnerable. The Me-262 could strike from above or behind with little warning, its heavy cannons tearing through bombers before escorts could respond. Allied pilots reported the same conclusion again and again. The jet could not be chased down. It chose when to fight and when to leave. For a brief moment, the balance of fear in the skies shifted. But the irony of the Me-262 lay in what might have been had it appeared in 1942. When Germany still possessed fuel, factories, and experienced pilots in abundance, it might have rewritten the air war entirely. Instead, it entered service when Germany was already on the defensive, its infrastructure shattered, and its options narrowed. What should have been a decisive weapon became a calculated risk, a gamble placed when the odds were already turning against it. That gamble was constrained by reality. Jet production demanded precision manufacturing Germany could no longer guarantee. Engines required rare metals and constant maintenance. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft as often as enemy action. Even when jets were built, trained pilots were scarce, and airfields were exposed to relentless Allied attacks. A revolutionary aircraft meant little if it could not be produced, fueled, protected, and sustained. As a result, the Me-262 fought in isolation. Individual sorties achieved remarkable success, but never at the scale required to change the war's trajectory. Losses mounted faster on the ground than in the air. Each destroyed jet represented not just an aircraft, but time, resources, and expertise Germany could not replace. The strategic gamble demanded numbers. Germany could only offer moments. The revelation came without illusion. The Me-262 was not a failure of engineering. It was a victim of timing. It entered the conflict carrying the future on its wings, but the present was already lost. The jet reshaped how wars would be fought, not how this one would end. And as Allied armies closed, the shock was not in what the Me-262 could do, but in how rarely it appeared. Each time the jet entered the skies, it confirmed every fear the Allies held, and every hope Germany still clung to. Bombers were destroyed with unsettling efficiency. Escort fighters were left behind, unable to respond. And yet, for all its performance, the jet remained an exception seen in flashes, never in force. A weapon capable of altering battles was present, but it was never present in numbers. Among German engineers and planners, belief persisted with almost stubborn intensity. On paper, the calculations were compelling. A small force of Me-262 seconds, properly concentrated, could shred bomber formations and impose unacceptable losses. Speed and firepower, they argued, could compensate for quantity. The jet, if unleashed fully, might yet break the rhythm of Allied air operations and buy Germany time to regroup, to negotiate, or simply to endure. The irony was that this belief emerged just as Germany's ability to act on it collapsed. The nation's industrial system, once a pillar of strength, had been battered relentlessly. Factories lay in ruins. Transportation networks were fractured. Skilled labor was depleted or displaced. The Me-262 demanded precision manufacturing and uninterrupted supply chains, conditions Germany could no longer provide. The aircraft's advantages were real, but so were the constraints that smothered them. The struggle to produce the jet revealed the limits of late-war innovation. Engines failed, quality checks. Airframes sat incomplete for lack of parts. Fuel shortages grounded completed aircraft before they ever flew a combat mission. Even when jets reached operational units, maintenance crews worked under constant threat of air attack. Production targets were revised downward again and again, each adjustment an admission of diminishing capacity. As a result, the Me-262 was deployed piecemeal. Individual pilots achieved remarkable success, but isolated victories could not compensate for strategic absence. Losses, whether from combat, accidents, or destruction on the ground, were irreplaceable. The jet was not defeated in the air. It was defeated by arithmetic. War, at its core, remained a contest of sustained power. The revelation was inescapable. The Me-262 had arrived with the power to change how wars would be fought, but not with the numbers required to change this one. Germany's inability to produce and deploy the jet at scale turned a revolutionary weapon into a symbol of lost opportunity. And as the war pressed closer to its conclusion, the lesson became clear. Even the most advanced machine cannot outrun time itself. The belief surrounding the Me-262 was clear and unwavering. This was the aircraft that would finally secure Germany's skies, shielding its cities and factories from the relentless pressure of Allied bombers. Faster than any escort fighter and armed with devastating firepower, the jet was meant to restore a balance long since lost. In theory, it would make daylight bombing untenable and force the Allies to reconsider their entire air strategy. The shock came not from the jet's failure, but from the enemy's response. Allied commanders did not panic. They observed. Reports were gathered, patterns analyzed, and vulnerabilities identified. The Me-262 was nearly untouchable at speed, but it was not invulnerable. Allied fighters began circling known jet airfields, waiting not for combat at altitude, but for takeoff and landing moments when speed offered no protection. The battle shifted from the skies to the runways. Here, the irony of the jet became unmistakable. Its greatest strength speed was also its greatest constraint. Long takeoff runs, fragile engines, and predictable operating bases created opportunities the Allies were quick to exploit. The Me-262 could dominate the air in isolation, but air superiority is not won in moments. It is sustained through presence, repetition, and endurance qualities Germany could no longer guarantee. For pilots, the struggle grew more acute with each sortie. Mechanical failures were common. Engines flamed out without warning. Replacement parts were scarce. Fuel shortages curtailed training and limited operations to the most urgent missions. Pilots flew knowing that survival depended as much on luck as skill. Even successful missions often ended with damaged aircraft grounded indefinitely, victims of maintenance realities rather than enemy fire. As these pressures mounted, the jet's impact began to diminish. Allied bomber formations adjusted routes and timing. Escort fighters refined interception tactics. Losses continued, but they no longer altered the broader campaign. What had once seemed a looming threat became a calculated risk, dangerous but manageable. The Me-262 forced adaptation, but adaptation was something the Allies could afford. The revelation was not dramatic, but decisive. Air superiority is not secured by innovation alone. It belongs to the side that can absorb disruption, respond with speed of its own, and sustain pressure over time. The Me-262 proved that the future of air combat had arrived, but it also proved something older and more enduring. Technology can shape a battle, but adaptability decides a war. And as Germany's skies grew ever more crowded with Allied aircraft, by the time the Me-262 entered service in meaningful numbers, Germany was no longer shaping events, it was reacting to them. The year 1944 found the Reich fighting for survival on every front. Armies were retreating in the east. Allied forces pressed in from the west. Above all, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, drained of experienced pilots, fuel, and operational freedom. Into this moment arrived the most advanced fighter aircraft the world had yet seen, burdened not only with expectation, but with the weight of a collapsing war. The irony was severe. The Me-262 promised speed beyond interception and firepower beyond resistance, yet it entered a system no longer capable of supporting such promise. Jets require time to train pilots, time to refine maintenance procedures, time to build infrastructure. Germany had none of it. Fuel shortages, limited flight hours, training was rushed. Aircraft were introduced directly into combat environments they had never been fully prepared to endure. What should have been a gradual revolution became an emergency measure. Pressure from the Allies tightened relentlessly. Bombing raids increased in scale and frequency, targeting not only cities and factories, but airfields, fuel depots, and transportation networks. Each successful strike narrowed the jet's already limited operating space. Runways were cratered faster than they could be repaired. Completed aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Even when Me-262 units were operational, they were often forced to relocate, disrupting maintenance and coordination. Speed in the air could not compensate for vulnerability on the ground. For pilots, the fight became one against exhaustion as much as the enemy. Missions were flown under constant threat of interception during takeoff, of engine failure at altitude, of returning to airfields already under attack. Losses accumulated quietly, sometimes without combat. A jet that crashed due to mechanical failure was no less gone than one shot down. Each loss carried consequences Germany could no longer absorb. The jet's promise clashed repeatedly with reality. Successful interceptions occurred, bombers were destroyed, and Allied crews felt the danger acutely. Yet these moments never accumulated into momentum. There were too few aircraft, too few pilots, and too little fuel. Every sortie felt isolated, detached from a broader strategy that no longer existed. The Me-262 fought not as the spearhead of a renewed air campaign, but as a series of desperate interruptions in an Allied advance that never truly slowed. Time became the enemy Germany could not defeat. Every week that passed favored the Allies, whose production expanded even as Germany's contracted. Allied aircraft losses were replaced quickly. German losses were permanent. The Me-262 could win encounters, but it could not win the calendar. Innovation had arrived at the wrong moment, introduced into a system already beyond recovery. The revelation was as sobering as it was inevitable. Technological superiority, no matter how profound, cannot overcome strategic exhaustion. The Me-262 represented the future of air combat, but it was forced to fight in a present defined by scarcity and collapse. As the war moved toward its conclusion, the jet remained airborne only in fragments brilliant, dangerous, and fleeting. And with each failed attempt to turn, the shock surrounding the Me-262 did not fade with familiarity, it deepened. Each combat appearance confirmed its raw power, yet each week also revealed how fragile that power truly was. Engines failed without warning. Aircraft were lost to accidents as often as enemy fire. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons indefinitely. The jet that promised mastery of the air proved difficult even to keep airborne. Speed alone, it seemed, could not compensate for instability. Despite these setbacks, belief endured. Within design bureaus and command staffs, there remained confidence that the Me-262 could mature into a reliable weapon. Engineers argued that early problems were inevitable with any revolutionary technology. Given time, they believed engine lifespans would improve, training would stabilize, and tactics would evolve. The jet was still young. Its potential, they insisted, had not yet been fully realized. But irony defined the aircraft's service life. The Me-262 was among the most advanced machines ever built, yet it was deployed under conditions that exposed its weaknesses rather than its strengths. Its engines, built from inferior alloys due to material shortages, wore out rapidly. Throttle mismanagement could cause catastrophic failure. High landing speeds left no margin for error on damaged runways. What should have been a controlled evolution became an uncontrolled experiment conducted in combat. For pilots, the struggle was relentless. Many transitioned directly from piston engine fighters with minimal training hours. They were expected to master new flight characteristics, new emergency procedures, and new combat tactics almost immediately. Mid-mission breakdowns were common. Flameouts at altitude forced risky glide landings. Surviving one sortie did not guarantee surviving the next. Skill mattered, but so did luck. The limited number of operational jets compounded every flaw. A handful of aircraft could not maintain continuous air presence. Losses, even minor ones, had outsized consequences. When a Me-262 failed to return, it was not simply an aircraft lost, it was a pilot, an engine, and weeks of production effort gone with it. Replacement was slow, often impossible. The jet was never defeated en masse. It was eroded piece by piece. These shortcomings were not solely technical. Strategic miscalculations haunted the program from the beginning. Conflicting roles delayed deployment. Infrastructure was never fully adapted to support jet operations. Airfields remained exposed. Production was fragmented. The Me-262 was treated as both miracle weapon and emergency solution, expected to compensate for failures far beyond its design. The revelation, when it came, was sobering. The jet did not fail because it lacked brilliance. It failed because brilliance alone cannot overcome misalignment between technology and strategy. The Me-262 required stability, planning, and time resources Germany no longer possessed. Its promise was real, but it was introduced into a system already unraveling. In the end, the the struggle embodied by the Me-262 was unlike any Germany had faced before. This was not merely the introduction of a new aircraft, but the arrival of an entirely new way of flying. For the first time, air combat was no longer constrained by propellers and piston engines. Thrust replaced torque. Speed ceased to be incremental and became transformative. Pilots who flew the jet understood immediately that they were no longer part of the familiar world of aerial warfare. They had crossed into something new. Yet revolutions rarely announce themselves with clarity. The Me-262 entered service amid chaos, not ceremony. Germany was retreating on every front, its skies contested daily, its industrial base fractured. The jet demanded order-stable airfields, uninterrupted fuel supplies, systematic training. Instead, it was introduced into an environment defined by scarcity and urgency. What should have been a controlled transition became an improvised leap forward under fire. The irony was profound. In pure technical terms, the Me-262 rendered nearly every Allied fighter obsolete. Speed alone reshaped engagement geometry. Dogfights became unnecessary. Interception became a matter of timing rather than maneuver. The jet's design pointed unmistakably toward the future, yet its impact on the present remained limited. The aircraft arrived at a moment when Germany no longer possessed the capacity to exploit what it had created. Still, the significance of the Me-262 could not be contained by circumstance. Allied intelligence officers, pilots, and engineers studied it closely. Encounters with the jet forced changes in escort tactics, base defense, and operational planning. More importantly, it shattered long-held assumptions about air power. The age of the propeller was ending, whether this war acknowledged it or not. For the men who flew against it, The Me-262 was a warning. For those who flew it, the aircraft was a paradox offering invincibility in motion and vulnerability at every other moment. It represented the future, but demanded conditions that only a post-war world could provide. In this sense, the jet was less a weapon of World War II than a preview of the conflicts to come. The revelation lay not in what the Me-262 achieved, but in what it proved. Technological revolutions do not wait for favorable circumstances. They arrive when the science is ready, not when nations are prepared. The jet marked the beginning of a new era in aviation, one defined by speed, altitude, and energy rather than maneuver alone. That future would be realized not by Germany, but by those who survived the war and learned from it. By the time the conflict ended, the Me-262 had not altered the outcome of World War II. Germany fell despite it, but the aircraft ensured that no future war would be fought the same way again. Engineers across the world absorbed its lessons. Designers adapted its principles. Within a decade, jet propulsion would dominate every major air force on Earth. The Me-262's legacy, then, was not victory, but transformation. It was a machine born too late to save the nation. The first encounters with the Me-262 unsettled the Allies. Bomber crews reported aircraft that appeared suddenly, attacked with devastating speed, and vanished before escorts could react. At altitude, Allied pilots felt briefly exposed, their long-held assumptions about air combat challenged in seconds. The jet did not fight on familiar terms. It rewrote them. For a moment, the skies felt uncertain again. But shock did not become paralysis. Allied air forces had spent years learning how to adapt under pressure, and the appearance of the jet triggered the same response as every previous German innovation: analysis, adjustment, and escalation. Intelligence officers gathered reports. Engineers examined wreckage. Commanders compared notes. The Me-262 was fast, but it was not invisible, and it did not operate alone. The irony lay in the balance of systems. While the Me-262 represented a leap forward in aircraft design, the Allies had quietly built a war machine defined not by single breakthroughs, but by integration. Radar coverage expanded steadily across Europe. Communications improved between bomber streams, escort fighters, and ground controllers. Tactics evolved faster than aircraft production ever could. The jet was revolutionary. The Allied response was cumulative. New countermeasures emerged with deliberate speed. Escort fighters were instructed not to chase jets at altitude, but to wait near known airfields. Patrols lingered over runways, watching for takeoffs and landings. Strafing attacks targeted jets when they were slowest and most vulnerable. The battle shifted again not to the open sky, but to the narrow margins where speed could no longer protect. Numbers also mattered. The Allies could afford losses. Germany could not. Each Me-262 sortie faced an opponent that could replace aircraft, pilots, and fuel at a pace Germany no longer matched. Radar-guided interception improved bomber formation cohesion. Fighter coverage became more flexible, more persistent. What had initially seemed like a sudden disruption gradually became another variable to be managed. The turning point came quietly. Allied losses stabilized. Bomber missions continued. The jet still claimed victories, but they no longer altered operational planning. Commanders accepted the Me-262 as a threat, serious but contained. The skies did not belong to the jet. They belonged to the side that could remain present day after day, sortie after sortie. For Germany, this shift was decisive. The Me-262 had been conceived as a weapon to force change upon the enemy. Instead, it forced adaptation, and adaptation was something the Allies could sustain. Each response reduced the jet's impact slightly, but consistently. Over time, those reductions accumulated. The revolutionary became manageable. The revelation was not about technology, but tempo. War favored the side that could learn faster than the enemy could innovate. The Me-262 changed the shape of air combat, but it could not change the pace at which the Allies absorbed new realities and adjusted accordingly. Its presence accelerated Allied coordination rather than undermining it. By late 1944, the jet no longer represented a looming unknown. It was a known quantity, dangerous, impressive, and limited. Allied air superiority did not vanish in the face of innovation. It absorbed it, and in doing so, it demonstrated a truth that extended. By the final months of the war, the Me-262 still flew, but no longer as a force capable of shaping events. Its presence in the sky was sporadic, its missions increasingly constrained by circumstance rather than ambition. The jet remained fast, dangerous, and technologically unmatched in many respects, yet it now operated within a shrinking window of opportunity. Germany's air war had become defensive in the purest sense, focused on survival rather than control. The irony of the aircraft's fate was unmistakable. Designed to reclaim dominance, the Me-262 now faced overwhelming Allied numbers, coordinated tactics, and near-total control of the skies. Its speed could no longer guarantee escape. Airfields were watched constantly. Takeoffs were perilous. Landings were rushed. The jet that once symbolized freedom of movement was increasingly confined to brief, carefully calculated sorties. Germany's industrial collapse marked the true turning point. Production lines faltered under bombing and shortages. Engines could not be replaced. Airframes went unfinished. Fuel allocations were slashed, to the point where aircraft existed only on paper. Even the most successful units found themselves grounded for days or weeks at a time, waiting for resources that never arrived. The Me-262's potential depended on a system that no longer functioned. Allied pressure intensified with methodical precision. Fighter sweeps targeted known jet bases. Bombers struck runways and supply depots. Radar coverage tightened, leaving little room for surprise. Each loss, whether in combat or on the ground, further reduced Germany's ability to recover. The jet did not fade in a single moment. It was worn down through repetition and imbalance. For pilots, the final phase was defined by inevitability. They flew, knowing that success would be temporary and survival uncertain. Missions achieved tactical victories, but these no longer translated into strategic effect. The Me-262 could still destroy bombers, still evade pursuit, still inspire fear, but fear alone could not reverse the course of the war. Momentum belonged entirely to the Allies. The revelation came quietly, without spectacle. The Me-262 had never been a failure of design. It was a failure of timing and circumstance. Introduced when Germany was already losing the capacity to support it, the jet was asked to compensate for structural collapse. No machine, however advanced, could carry that burden. By the war's end, the Me-262 stood as a symbol rather than a solution. It represented what German engineering could achieve and what strategic miscalculation had squandered. The aircraft that pointed unmistakably toward the future was trapped in the ruins of the present. Its influence would be felt long after the fighting stopped, but not where it was intended. Captured, studied, and imitated, the Me-262 lived on in the designs of post-war air forces across the world. Its legacy shaped the Cold War skies rather than the battlefields of Europe. In this sense, the jet did not die with Germany's defeat. It was simply too early for its own era. The final truth of the Me-262 is neither triumphant nor tragic. It is instructive. Innovation alone cannot reverse decline. Timing matters. Systems matter. The jet arrived with the power to change history, but history had already moved beyond the point where power alone was enough. And as the war ended, the Me-262 remained what it had always been, a glimpse of tomorrow, introduced in the final days of yesterday. The final shock of the Me-262 did not come during the war, but after it. When the fighting ended and the airfields fell silent, Allied engineers and intelligence officers moved quickly to secure what remained of Germany's most advanced aircraft. They approached it not as a defeated weapon, but as a revelation. The jet had not won the war, yet its existence forced an unavoidable conclusion. Aviation had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The irony was stark. Built to save a collapsing regime, the Me-262 would instead serve those who had defeated it. Its swept wings, engine placement, and high-speed aerodynamics became subjects of intense study. Test flights were conducted under new flags. Reports circulated through design bureaus in Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. What Germany could not exploit in war, the victors would refine in peace. This moment marked a turning point in military aviation. The Me-262 demonstrated that jet propulsion was not experimental theory, but operational reality. It exposed the limits of propeller-driven fighters and redefined what air superiority would mean in the future. Speed, climb rate, and energy management replaced turning radius and close-range maneuvering. Air combat itself was rewritten. Equally important were the lessons drawn from its failures. The jet taught designers what not to do, how fragile innovation could be without infrastructure, training, and logistics to support it. Engine reliability, maintenance cycles, runway requirements, and pilot transition training all became central concerns in post-war planning. The Me-262 was studied not only for its brilliance, but for the costs of introducing revolutionary technology too quickly and too late. Across the post-war world, its influence became unmistakable. Early Cold War jets carried its genetic imprint. Designers adopted its solutions while correcting its weaknesses. Nations that had never flown a jet during the war now raced to build fleets defined by speed rather than maneuver. Within a decade, propeller-driven fighters vanished from frontline service. The future the Me-262 previewed arrived in full force. The revelation embedded in its legacy was broader than aviation alone. The Me-262 became a case study in timing, strategy, and systems thinking. It proved that technological superiority cannot compensate for strategic collapse, but it also proved that innovation, once revealed, cannot be undone. Ideas outlive the nations that create them. Knowledge does not surrender. In retrospect, the Me-262 occupies a unique place in history. It was not a wonder weapon in the way propaganda imagined. It did not alter the outcome of World War II, yet it altered the trajectory of warfare itself. It marked the end of one era and the unmistakable beginning of another. The aircraft's true legacy is therefore measured not in victories or losses, but in influence. It changed how engineers thought, how pilots trained, and how nations planned for future conflict. The skies of the second half of the 20th century, from Korea to the Cold War, were shaped by lessons first written in the final, desperate years over Germany. The Me-262 arrived too late to matter where it was built, but too early to be forgotten. It stands as a reminder that the future often appears first in moments of crisis, imperfect and unfinished. Those who survive inherit it. Those who create it do not always control its consequences. In the end, the Me-262 did exactly what history often demands of such machine. The consequence of the Me-262 was not defeat in the air, but opportunity lost on the ground. Its potential was never truly tested at scale, never allowed to accumulate into decisive force. What Germany possessed was not a jet fleet, but fragments of one isolated aircraft, scattered squadrons, and moments of brilliance separated by long silences. The weapon that might have altered the tempo of the war arrived without the system required to sustain it. In theory, the Me-262 represented a solution to Germany's greatest strategic problem, Allied air dominance. In practice, that solution remained perpetually out of reach. Production delays, material shortages, and conflicting priorities ensured that the jet was never deployed in the numbers required to matter. Factories produced too slowly, engines failed too often, fuel allocation dwindled. Each obstacle compounded the next, turning innovation into frustration. The irony was unmistakable. Germany had achieved a technological breakthrough years ahead of its enemies, yet failed to translate that advantage into operational reality. The jet did not lack speed or firepower. It lacked time to refine, to train, to mass produce, and to integrate into a coherent strategy. What could have been decisive in 1942 became symbolic in 1944. This failure was not confined to engineering alone. Strategic indecision haunted the program from its earliest days. Arguments over the aircraft's role delayed deployment. Infrastructure was never fully adapted. Airfields remained exposed. Training pipelines were rushed or bypassed entirely. The Me-262 was treated as both miracle cure and emergency measure, expected to compensate for years of attrition and miscalculation. No machine could bear that weight. The cost of this delay was cumulative. Every month the jet remained underdeveloped strengthened the Allied advantage. Every loss, whether from combat, accident, or destruction on the ground, was irreplaceable. Meanwhile, Allied production expanded relentlessly. Aircraft losses were absorbed. Tactics evolved. Countermeasures matured. By the time the Me-262 appeared in the skies, the strategic environment it was meant to change no longer existed. The jet's story became one of contrast. In the air, it demonstrated what the future would look like. On the ground, it revealed how the present had already been lost. Its existence forced the Allies to adapt, but adaptation favored those with resources, stability, and time. Germany possessed none of these in sufficient measure. The revelation embedded in the Me-262's fate is neither dramatic nor comforting. Innovation does not operate in isolation. It depends on systems, industrial, logistical, human, that must already be in place. When those systems fail, even the most advanced technology becomes ornamental. The jet was not squandered by ignorance, but by delay. It arrived into a world that could no longer receive it. In retrospect, the Me-262 stands as a cautionary symbol, not of wasted genius, but of misaligned timing. It shows how being first is meaningless without being ready, how breakthroughs demand preparation long before desperation sets in. Germany's inability to deploy the jet when it still had the capacity to exploit it transformed a potential advantage into a historical footnote. And yet, the legacy remains bittersweet rather than hollow. For the men who flew the Me-262, the experience was unlike anything else in the war. Even amid defeat, they understood they were witnessing and participating in something extraordinary. The first moments after takeoff erased familiar sensations. Acceleration pressed them back into their seats. The ground fell away faster than instinct expected. In the cockpit of the jet, the rules they had learned no longer fully applied. They were no longer flying yesterday's war. Many pilots spoke later of pride quiet, restrained, but unmistakable. To fly the Me-262 was to step into the future. They knew the aircraft's speed, its power, its potential. Against Allied bombers, the jet delivered a sense of control, long absent from the Luftwaffe's final years. Attacks were swift, decisive, almost clinical. For brief moments, the imbalance of the air war seemed to narrow, and with it, a measure of dignity was restored. Yet that pride existed alongside frustration. Pilots were acutely aware of the limitations surrounding them. Missions were rare, fuel was rationed, training was rushed, aircraft were lost to mechanical failure. As often as to enemy action, they flew, knowing that success in the air did not translate into progress on the ground. Each victory felt isolated, disconnected from a larger purpose that no longer existed. The irony of their situation was difficult to escape. These men possessed skill, courage, and a machine years ahead of its time. But they were trapped inside a collapsing system. Strategic decisions made far above them determined when they could fly, where they could land, and whether they would return to a usable airfield at all. Their individual excellence could not compensate for structural failure. Survivors later described the emotional weight of that contradiction. They had lived the dream of every fighter pilot to command the fastest aircraft in the world, yet they did so in the shadow of inevitable defeat. Takeoffs were exhilarating. Landings were tense. Each flight carried the unspoken knowledge that the war could not be changed, only endured. Combat itself was only part of the danger. Takeoff runs were long and exposed. Allied fighters waited patiently. Engines failed without warning. Returning to base often meant navigating bombed runways and damaged infrastructure. Survival depended on discipline, precision, and luck in equal measure. The jet demanded perfection in a war that allowed none. And still, many pilots remembered the Me-262 with affection rather than bitterness. It represented what was possible when engineering and ambition aligned. It gave them a glimpse of a world beyond desperation, a world where air combat would be decided by speed, energy, and design rather than attrition. That glimpse mattered even if it came too late. The revelation embedded in their memories is subtle but enduring. The Me-262 was not just a weapon, it was an experience. For its pilots, it embodied both achievement and loss. They had touched the future, but only briefly. Their stories are not tales of triumph or regret alone, but of contrast between what they flew and the reality around them. In the end, the pilots who lived the dream carried its weight long after the war ended. They knew the aircraft could not save Germany. They knew their skill could not overcome time. But they also knew they had flown something. Germany unveiled the Me-262 to win the war. But by the time it reached the skies in meaningful numbers, the war had already been lost. This was the final and cruel symmetry of its story. A machine designed to restore dominance arrived in an age when dominance itself had slipped beyond reach. The jet did not fail in flight. It failed in timing. What the Me-262 revealed, above all else, was the cost of delay. Years of experimentation, hesitation, and strategic confusion had narrowed the moment when innovation could still matter. By 1944, Germany's industrial base was shattered, its fuel scarce, its pilots depleted. The jet entered a battlefield defined not by possibility, but by exhaustion. Its brilliance illuminated the gap between what could be imagined and what could be sustained. There is a temptation, in hindsight, to treat the Me-262 as a near miss, an invention that might have changed everything if only it had arrived sooner. But this view misses the deeper lesson. Technology does not exist in isolation. It depends on systems, production lines, logistics, training, and coherent strategy. Without these, even the most advanced weapon becomes a gesture rather than a solution. The Me-262 was not a miracle weapon undone by chance. It was a mirror held up to a nation already in decline. Its struggles reflected Germany's broader condition, brilliant engineering constrained by strategic paralysis and material collapse. The jet did not lose the war. It simply arrived too late to save a system that had already failed itself. And yet, its impact cannot be dismissed. In the skies, the Me-262 demonstrated a future that no one could ignore. Speed replaced maneuver. Energy replaced endurance. Air combat crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The jet did not change who won World War II, but it changed how the next wars would be fought. This is where the story turns from defeat to legacy. The Me-262 forced the world to reckon with what was coming. Allied engineers studied it. Designers adapted its principles. Air forces reshaped doctrine around its lessons. Within a few short years, the propeller-driven fighter, once the symbol of air power, became obsolete. The jet age followed inevitably. The irony is enduring. Germany created a weapon that reshaped global aviation, yet could not benefit from it. Others inherited the future it revealed. The knowledge survived the regime that produced it. In this way, the Me-262 stands as a reminder that ideas outlive outcomes, and innovation does not belong to any single nation once it is revealed. For the pilots who flew it, the jet was both triumph and burden. For the engineers who built it, it was proof of what was possible. For history, it is a lesson written in steel and flame. Wars are not won by invention alone. They are won by preparation, timing, and the ability to turn potential into sustained power. The Me-262